President Donald Trump just said the U.S. has not necessarily been focused on this country and trade. Also, he says the United States may not reach a negotiated trade deal with Canada.
July 2025.
On a sweltering July day in 2025, President Donald Trump stood before a podium, his voice carrying the weight of frustration and defiance. The United States, he declared, had not been focused enough on its own interests, particularly in trade. His words, sharp and pointed, were aimed at Canada, a longtime ally now at the center of a brewing economic storm. Days before a critical August 1st deadline, Canada shocked Washington with a bombshell. It would not renew agricultural trade agreements with the United States. Over $22 billion worth of American beef, corn, milk, and grain, staples that had long flowed across the northern border, were suddenly stranded, rejected in a move that sent shockwaves through the U.S. economy. Trump fired back, accusing Canada of disrespect and betrayal, but the truth runs deeper than a single diplomatic spat. This was no impulsive act from Ottawa. It was the culmination of a year of escalating tensions, driven by the Trump administration's aggressive tariff policies. The fallout is not confined to farms or trade balances, it ripples through grocery stores, small towns, and dinner tables across America. The U.S.-Canada food crisis of 2025 is not just a trade dispute, it's a stark warning about the fragility of America's global economic standing and the cost of policies that prioritize confrontation over cooperation. The roots of this crisis trace back to March 2025, when President Trump signed a sweeping tariff package targeting Canada. With rates as high as 35% on aluminum and copper, 25% on steel, and 10% on Canadian natural gas and agricultural imports, the policy was billed as a defense of American industry. Trade analysts, however, saw it for what it was, a high-stakes pressure tactic to bend Canada to Washington's will. The tariffs were not just numbers on a ledger, they were a gauntlet thrown at the feet of a trusted partner. Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, responded with a calculated precision that caught the White House off guard. Bill C-202, passed swiftly and decisively, empowered Ottawa to halt imports from any nation deemed a threat to its food supply chain security. The target was unmistakable: the United States. Within 90 days, Canada slashed orders for American beef, grain, and dairy. Over 150,000 tons of beef from states like Texas, Nebraska, and Kansas were denied entry. Cold storage facilities filled to capacity, production lines stalled, and the value of American agricultural goods plummeted. Canada didn't stop at closing its borders. In a strategic pivot, Ottawa forged new trade agreements with Brazil, Argentina, and European nations, partners offering stable policies and no political baggage. By June, Mexico, America's fiercest regional competitor, had seized $1.2 billion in food supply contracts once held by U.S. producers. A market that American farmers had long considered their birthright had flipped overnight. This wasn't mere retaliation, it was a deliberate move to untangle Canada from its reliance on U.S. food imports. For Ottawa, Washington was no longer a dependable partner, and the economic fallout of that eroded trust is staggering. The loss of the Canadian market is not just a blow to American farmers, it's a gut punch to the entire agricultural economy. Canada has been more than a customer. It's been a stable, accessible lifeline for thousands of farms across the Midwest. When Canada rejected 150,000 tons of beef, shipments became trapped in cold storage facilities from Texas to Iowa. These facilities, once bustling hubs of global distribution, transformed into frozen prisons. Storage costs skyrocketed, and many facilities stopped accepting new shipments, leaving farmers with nowhere to turn. Some sold off cattle at a fraction of their value, 30 to 40 cents on the dollar, while others, particularly small and medium-sized farms, faced a grim reality: wait for bankruptcy or liquidate everything. With feed, veterinary care, and fuel prices soaring, every day of unsold inventory bled money. Banks, sensing the risk, tightened agricultural loans, pushing farmers closer to the edge. The damage didn't stop at the farm gate. Slaughterhouses in the Midwest cut shifts, leaving workers with reduced hours or no jobs at all. Truck drivers lost contracts as transport demand dried up. Feed dealers shuttered their businesses, unable to survive without customers. A once vibrant supply chain is now choking, starved of cash flow. The ripple effects are felt in every corner of rural America. In small towns across Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and South Dakota, the economic lifeblood tied to agriculture is draining away. Gas stations sit empty, farm equipment repair shops see their revenue vanish, and corner stores struggle to stay afloat. Local schools, already stretched thin, are cutting staff and canceling bus routes to cover fuel costs. Health clinics, vital for elder care and routine checkups, are scaling back services. These towns, built on the promise of farming, are starting to feel like ghost towns, abandoned by the very policies meant to protect them. For American consumers, the crisis has brought a bitter surprise. Many expected a surplus of unsold food to drive prices down, but the opposite has happened. In supermarkets from Texas to Ohio, beef prices have surged 18% to 25%. A pound of sirloin now costs over $6, a level not seen since 1950. Ground beef, once a staple for working-class families, hovers near $5 a pound. Chicken, eggs, milk, and grains, caught in the ripple effects of disrupted production and transportation, have jumped 10% to 15%. The reason lies in the supply chain itself. When exports collapsed, processing plants scaled back, cutting shifts and output. The cost of storing goods in overflowing warehouses, combined with high borrowing rates from tighter monetary policies, has driven production costs through the roof. Consumers, with no bargaining power, are left to bear the burden, paying more for less while their incomes stagnate in a mild recession gripping farm states. The hardest hit are those least equipped to absorb the shock. Retirees on fixed incomes and low-income families, particularly in the Midwest and South, are cutting back on essentials. A June 2025 Gallup survey revealed that 36% of Americans over 55 have reduced red meat consumption in the past 3 months due to cost. Public schools, nursing homes, and food shelters, reliant on federal nutrition programs, are struggling as funding for SNAP has been slashed. States like Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas have resorted to shrinking meal portions in schools and senior programs. Meanwhile, efforts to pivot to imports from Brazil or Argentina have only driven prices higher due to logistics, inspections, and transport risks. In a cruel twist, Canadian consumers are reaping the benefits of their country's pivot, enjoying lower prices and greater stability through new trade partners like Mexico. American food, once a symbol of national pride, sits frozen in storage while Americans pay more for imported alternatives. The crisis is not just economic, it's social. Rural communities, where every dollar is tied to fields, barns, and freight depots, are unraveling. Young people, already hesitant to stay in farming, are leaving for cities, seeking jobs in warehousing or manual labor. Those left behind, often the elderly, tend to a few acres with battered pickups and fading dreams. Rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide are climbing in rural areas, a silent epidemic born not of a virus but of abandonment. Trust in institutions is eroding, and the sense of community, built over generations, is cracking under financial strain. When Canada said no to American beef, milk, and corn, it wasn't just rejecting goods, it was rejecting a trade system that had grown risky and unstable. The price is being paid by ordinary Americans whose livelihoods and communities are fraying. This crisis also exposes the limits of the America First doctrine, revived by President Trump in early 2025. The slogan promised to reclaim economic dominance, but its execution through unilateral tariffs and broken trade agreements has backfired. Canada, once a steadfast ally, is no longer in America's orbit. It has built a new trade network stretching from Europe to South America to Asia, diversifying its supply chains and sending a clear message. The United States is no longer a reliable partner. Other nations are following suit. Japan, South Korea, Germany, and even Mexico are restructuring their import strategies, seeking alternatives to U.S. goods. America's status as the linchpin of global trade is wobbling, and the cost of that lost credibility is immense. In global commerce, trust is the strongest currency. One broken commitment, one tariff weaponized for political gain, can take years to repair. Without trust, companies hesitate to expand, and countries shy away from long-term contracts. The irony is stark. America First was pitched as a path to greatness, but it risks leaving the United States isolated in a global economy increasingly driven by cooperation and stability. The 2025 U.S.-Canada food crisis is not just a trade dispute, it's a wake-up call. It reveals the consequences of protectionism built on conflict rather than collaboration. Farmers, consumers, and entire communities are paying the price, not politicians. From overflowing warehouses to empty dinner tables, from struggling small towns to skyrocketing grocery bills, every link in the chain is straining. If this trend continues, the question looms large: who is truly being protected by America First? The answer, it seems, is no one but the architects of a policy that has turned allies into adversaries and prosperity into peril. The crisis is a reminder that global trade is not a zero-sum game. When one nation stumbles, others step in. As American farmers watch their livelihoods freeze in storage, Mexican trucks roll fresh shipments into Canadian supermarkets. As U.S. consumers grapple with rising prices, Canadian shoppers enjoy stability. The United States, once a beacon of agricultural might, now faces a reckoning. The path forward requires more than fiery rhetoric or punitive tariffs. It demands a return to trust, cooperation, and strategic partnership. Without it, the U.S. risks becoming a bystander in a global economy it once led. The 2025 food crisis is not the end, but it is a warning. The question is whether America will heed it before the damage becomes irreparable.